So it's been more than 7-8 months since DeepSeek R1 released, and this pattern from Chinese AI labs has continued. Alibaba released a lot of models with Qwen, ByteDance came out, and 2 weeks ago there was Moonshot AI's Kimi K2, and today we have Zhifu AI's GLM 4.5, which has agentic capabilities, reasoning, and coding capabilities, and the company claims that on benchmarks it's even better than Anthropic's Claude 4.0 Opus. And this trend of China building open source models and absolutely crushing it on benchmarks seems to continue. But here's the problem with Chinese AI labs. We have very little information as to what happens inside these companies. And that's not the case with, let's say, Google, OpenAI, or Meta, because you have Sam Altman, Sundar Pichai, or Mark Zuckerberg coming out in the open, giving media interviews, and giving a good idea of what's happening inside the company and their vision for the future. To help all of you understand the same, I sat down in a conversation with a Hong Kong-based analyst called Grace Shao, who specializes in the Chinese tech ecosystem. She has worked with the CNBC, the CGTN, and Alibaba, and also studied at Tsinghua University, which happens to be one of the country's finest.
What specifically is this Chinese approach of making AI models open source? What is the benefit for them? Is this a show of power to the world, so that everybody can use these AI models and say, hey, China is making great AI models today? So what's the strategy behind these Chinese companies for making their models open source?
So to get really into it, I think from a very societal perspective, I think China's DeepSeek, at least, when it came out, Liang Wenfeng himself, the founder of DeepSeek, said, look, I want to put the most frontier technology and innovation available to all researchers. And this includes, especially for the Chinese researchers, he genuinely believes from a personal philosophical point of view that it's better to enable developers to be more innovative, to kind of harness and nurture, healthy market competition. So that was his approach. From, I think, another point of view, there's a nuance layer where a lot of people are saying from China is also, there's been so much kind of criticism of Chinese researchers copying and reiterating on US innovation, and that is kind of what happened a lot from a lot of the internet era, what we saw in consumer applications. But I think for this generation, they're saying, look, they want to be proud and they want to put their technology and research out there and say, we're really innovating in engineering. Here is actually proof for it. So there's also a personal level for a lot of them. And then I think obviously it goes back to the technical discussion where open source or open weight versus closed is not something new to AI. And, it's been widely kind of discussed and argued in the tech development space and over the last decade even. So I think it's really just a different approach at this point. But you can't say one is better than the other, but definitely the open weight perspective is saying, I rather put the technology in the hands of the developers and harness more innovation and vertical integration and consumer integration than really just hoard all the resources or hoard that kind of know-how per se.
And of course, till date, DeepSeek has achieved so much success in terms of numbers, adoption, API usage, and so much more, but we really have little information about the founder or the inner workings of the company. So who is the founder after all, and why has he made such a limited number of media appearances? Here's what Grace has to tell us.
I think definitely, he's a pretty media shy guy, and you can tell by the few interviews or public appearances he's had. He's a nerd. He's very, very brilliant, smart, but he's definitely not a flashy businessman or anything. But since DeepSeek's release and shot again China's AI and tech scene to the front and center of the global stage, I think he has become a national hero. In fact, he's even represented the AI and tech space and met with certain government officials at a high profile level, that's been broadcasted nationally. So yes, about him, I think he's really interesting. He's born in the 1980s. So actually, he's in his 40s and not as young as some of the other leaders that we're seeing in the AI space that are a lot of them born in the 1990s. But even then, he actually grew up, like I mentioned earlier, with China's economic rise. And he grew up in a small city in southern China, in Guangdong, actually very close to Hong Kong. So just up the mainland and Hong Kong's border. And I believe his parents were actually like very simple, like they were primary school teachers and not like, tech like magnets or anything. But he simply was very, very pushed on his academic drive, and he was very smart even at a young age. Apparently, there's a lot of even interviews of his primary school teachers saying he was just naturally so good at science and math at a young age. So I think, to understand it is that at a young age, he was academically driven. And like I mentioned earlier about some of the schools, at 17 years old, he entered the national state examination called Gaokao. This is the entrance exam from high school to university, and he scored number 1 in his region or something like that, and got a space, secured a spot at Zhejiang University, which is a top university in China. I would say top 3, top 5 at least. And it's definitely, become more noticed by the rest of the world right now, this university. He majored actually in EE, so electrical engineering, and I believe later on he did study AI and information communication engineering later on in his master's. And actually, what people know but don't know details about is that he didn't go into the AI space for the first decade of his career. He was really smart, and he created a hedge fund, and he started his own hedge fund. It was actually one of the most successful quant hedge funds in China, but he was super low key. The rumors are actually by 2021, 2022, there was more than $22 billion under asset management. So it was a really, really big hedge fund actually. But again, he was so low key, low profile that no one really knew about him or cared about him, in the public space. And then he was really apparently driven by, again, he became rich. He was like, I have all this money, I have all these resources. He was driven by the pivot in 2023. He started to pivot because he was driven by the takeoff of GPT in 2023. And he was like, I have all these GPUs he was going to use for all his quant trading, right? And he's like, what am I going to do? I have all this crazy talent. So he spun off a team of incredibly, insanely smart, young talent. And they were all born in the 90s and some even in the 2000s. And that's how they started DeepSeek. So DeepSeek was around for a while, and I heard about it maybe 6 months before R1 came out. But even then, it was very mysterious, and no one really knew about it. It was kind of oh, there's this random rich nerd that's funding an LLM company, but no one really knew the details of it. So I think it's really interesting. And now, how he's seen in China is for sure a national hero. And I think it's the perfect rags to riches story kind of, and the STEM nerd story as well. He's really propelled not just the AI industry, but also I think, again, the Chinese, even I think national pride to the front and center again. And it's said that last year when he went back for CNY, Chinese New Year, he was really largely celebrated. His whole hometown was all decorated, but he doesn't live there anymore. He apparently either lives in Hangzhou or Beijing now.
And by now it's also quite clear that the number one factor aiding the success of these Chinese AI models are of course the talent. And it's not just the internal talent in China. You also have a lot of people with Chinese origin ending up in the United States and working with big tech companies. For example, take a look at this number from a New York Times report from last year. It says that 38% of researchers in the United States have China as their country of origin. And even Mark Zuckerberg's hiring spree from OpenAI, Apple, and many other companies had so many Chinese engineers on this list. So where do all these people come from? How is the research and the academic ecosystem in China? How do their MITs, Stanfords, or even IITs of the country look like?
Yeah, I think this is something really interesting I've been asked a lot about, because I think if you're in Asia, you're in India, I'm in Hong Kong right now, and we're actually quite familiar with some of the top institutions in this part of the world, right? Including many from India, including many in Singapore, many in China. We all know that actually, whether it's big tech or even the investment banks, that, they've always recruited heavily from these institutions. So from China's perspective, Tsinghua, Peking, which is actually just Beijing University, Zhejiang University, the alma mater of Liang Wenfeng, DeepSeek's founder, etc. These schools are they've always just, educated some of the top talents and brightest minds in this part of the world. And many of them would have pursued maybe even a master's or PhD in the US. So I think this wasn't a shocker for me to hear that a lot of these research from these institutions. But in the West, I think they were definitely kind of overseen because, again, a generation ago, I would say a lot of the, top talent, even the entrepreneurs in China, would have gone to the West to pursue a higher education and then return to China. And I'm sure it's kind of similar to what you're witnessing in India right now as well, right? And I think it's quite interesting, people know of Li Kai-fu and people like him, but they're all very glossy and American educated, or even Zhou Cai, they're actually like Chinese, American, Chinese, Canadians. But this generation, I think there were two reasons that a lot of these researchers were not educated in the West. One is simply because, frankly, I think Tsinghua, Peking, Zhejiang are really, really, really good schools. And, to get into any of these schools, actually, it's no easier than getting into a Harvard, Stanford. If anything, by the odds of just numbers of the population in China, it's actually harder to be the top student to get into that. Most of these students were they scored in number 1 to number 3, the top 3 of each province in China to even, claim a spot there. I think that was a very pragmatic reason. And a very unfortunate geopolitical reason is that we're seeing less top researchers go to the West because of the, areas they're studying now are considered sensitive. And I spoke to a, professor who used to teach at Duke about this. And he said, he's definitely seeing less of this kind of collaboration. Unfortunately, it's not even due to, the unwillingness to go, but it's because you just cannot even get your student visas approved if you're studying artificial intelligence or studying certain engineering. And then I think, there's definitely that sense of that ecosystem. So the students that are being fed into DeepSeek or going and joining these institutions are mostly all born and raised and bred and educated fully in China at this point. And there is less of a desire, I think, to go to the West. For the third, actually more side reason, which I think is also just that quality life in China has also improved drastically in the last 10 to 20 years. And similar to India again, we have a massive upper middle class now in Asia, in these big mega economies where, they grew up with not abundance, but they definitely did not have to worry about food and shelter or anything. So actually the upside of working for a big tech in the US right now is just not as attractive as it was to abandon your family and friends and culture and everything and what you know of your hometown and everything. So what you would make at Alibaba or DeepSeek in terms of salary is probably very similar to what you would make at OpenAI.
It's also unfair to say that talent is the only factor contributing to the success of AI models in China. Of course, they do end up getting a lot of funds. But how does their venture capital ecosystem look like? Do they have a Y Combinator of their own? Here are some of the shocking details that you did not know existed.
So I would say the Chinese VC space was really vibrant, during, I would say, pre-trade war, let's be honest. And I think the reality is it was actually really driven by USD investment. And, a lot of Chinese VC and PE did, domestic ones that come up, RMB denominated funds did come up. But a lot of the tech companies you think of are Chinese, like even the Babas and the Tencents, these massive conglomerates these days, their first pot of gold, actually, a lot of them were from the West and some from the US, in Tencent's, this situation is quite interesting, actually. It's South African, but, it was actually not domestic. So when the trade war took off, unfortunately, there was a lot of geopolitical implications on businesses and in the investment space as well. And we did see, a slowdown in the space, and some of the American or European funds pull out of the Chinese ecosystem or even spin off their business. So, the high profile one, Sequoia, where, they actually backed, all of the big names of in consumer tech in China, but they actually spun off and now they call themselves Hongshan China, which is Sequoia's quite literal translation into Chinese. And, there were similar kind of, I guess, China shedding strategy rolled out. We saw over the last couple of years. So that did make fundraising kind of harder for some of the AI startups now. But that said, DeepSeek was a standalone case. Again, not many companies are founded by existing billionaires that are running massive hedge funds with, pocket deep enough to fund themselves. So that was definitely different. And they definitely did change the narrative of what AI companies needed, because they made everyone re-question what big tech was trying to tell everyone, which was like more money equals better AI. Like that just wasn't what it meant. DeepSeek, reshuffled that kind of focus and said, what about better engineering? Can we actually, reach so-called better AI with more efficiency and less resources? And this includes capital as well as obviously environmental resources that's being fed into it. So that's like kind of that DeepSeek story. In terms of the more avid investors right now, obviously there are still very big and influential players in China, like Jin Fund and Tongshan, etc., Primavera, etc. These are all existing domestic VC and private equity funds. But I would say actually the biggest incubators and investors are the BATs themselves. So what's interesting is the few you mentioned just now, like the startups, like the four tigers, amongst the four, I believe three of them are actually backed by ByteDance, Alibaba, and Tencent. And this is a legacy that they've actually been kind of continuing even since internet consumer stage. And, traditionally, even there was kind of a joke or unspoken rule that there was Alibaba camp and a Tencent camp within Chinese consumer internet space. So if you're backed by one or the other, you basically operate within that ecosystem, whether it's, payment only using Alipay or you only using WeChat Pay or, whatever. But that was disrupted by the 2021-2022 internet regulatory crackdown in China, which really focused on anti-monopoly, practices. So that is all the context on why overall China's AI ecosystem seemed a bit slower in receiving funding or prominent capital injection in the last couple of years. Manus is a special case, and I think it's going to be the start of something new. So Manus actually received a investment from US VC Benchmark recently, only like a month or two ago, or maybe like April, May-ish. But basically since then, it really started, reshifting the narrative again, because we know that there is a US control on USD investment into China, into so-called sensitive sectors such as semiconductors, AI, and robotics. So for a very long time, none of the US investors were actively investing in the Chinese space in here. Many have expressed interest, obviously, and but geopolitics out of our control. I'm merely a business analyst. But I think for business leaders, they wanted to still expose themselves to USD investment in China. So what they have done is set up shop in Singapore, Hong Kong, or other places elsewhere, but Singapore being kind of the top choice. And it's very interesting because Singapore, in many ways, first of all, everyone speaks English, and a very large population speaks Mandarin. So culturally and language-wise, it's actually served as a very easy landing spot for Chinese talent to go and to attract Western, capital or talent. It's also obviously politically, frankly, a pretty neutral space between the China-US trade war. And beyond that, it's actually by, not by planning, but I think by natural growth, it's become a very strong tech hub for Asia. So whether it's the Google, the Netflix of the world, or the Tencent and ByteDance of the world, they've all have their APAC headquarters in Singapore. So it has a very strong talent and skill set base there, and expat base there. So all of these different factors have made Singapore one of the top choices for Chinese companies to move there. And I bring this up is because Manus just apparently cut everyone in China like last week and moved their whole team to Singapore, and have been recruiting heavily and mostly recruiting from the employees of the employee pools of ByteDance and Alibaba and so on. So it's definitely going to be an interesting trend. I don't know if there's going to be hurdles going forward, but I think that's definitely what you're seeing with a lot of Chinese startups that still want to sell to the West as a predominant market or want to attract Western capital as a predominant investor.
By now, we all hope that you have a good and a basic understanding of how the AI ecosystem operates in China. Well, that's not everything you need to know. Of course, there are many more details. For example, Nvidia's restriction for selling its GPUs in the country, and how China is finding unique and amusing ways of smuggling GPUs inside the country. You can find more such coverage on our website or on the AIM TV YouTube channel. For now, that's it from us. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and one day I do hope I'm sitting here talking the same way about the Indian AI ecosystem, and I really hope it happens soon. Like, share and subscribe for more such videos, and always remember to think AI, think AIM.